on a cloudless Tuesday morning, courage and strength answered amid the fire and smoke in New York City, over a Pennsylvania meadow, and in this very building, as innocent people from 91 countries were murdered on our soil.
Secretary of Defense James Mattis speaking at the Pentagon this morning, where 184 people were killed 17 years ago today. In all, nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks, the worst ever in the United States. And as we remember and honor all those who lost their lives and the men and women who showed incredible bravery in the response, the question we have to ask nearly 2 decades later is, are we safer today? To help answer this, I'm joined by Ali Soufan. He was one of the lead investigators for the FBI, where he worked as a special agent in the counterterrorism division. And even before 9/11, he was already focused on al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden following the bombing of the USS Cole. He's also the author of the book Anatomy of Terror, From the Death of bin Laden to the Rise of the Islamic State. I mean, you've been working on this issue much longer than most Americans have been thinking about this. Are we safer, given what we didn't do right leading up to 9/11? Are we safer today than we were then?
I think if you look overall about the capabilities that our intelligence and law enforcement entities and agencies have, the way they cooperate with each other and share information, the way we work on a state, local, and federal level, especially through the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, we're definitely a lot better than we used to be before 9/11. If you want to look at the threat itself and how it mutated after 9/11, and especially after the Iraq War and after the Arab Spring, the ideology is way more spread. The ideology of terrorism, the jihadi Salafism, is way more spread than it used to be before 9/11. On the eve of 9/11, bin Laden had 400 members of al-Qaeda who pledged allegiance to him. Today, there are thousands upon thousands who adhere to the ideology and the narrative of Osama bin Laden in places like Syria, in places like Yemen, in places like Somalia, the Sahel region. Literally, that kind of cancer is spread from the western
So we think of these groups as smaller and less structured. They're much more diffuse, but they're reaching people who otherwise you don't have to go now to Afghanistan and pledge your allegiance that way. Now you do it just as you're about to do a lone wolf attack.
Exactly, but also the mentality of these terrorist organizations, especially al-Qaeda, and that was actually an order that was given to them by bin Laden before the Navy SEALs bullets took him down. The calculus changed. So now, instead of focusing on the United States and the West, they start to take advantage of local conflicts spread around the Muslim world in order to recruit more, in order to rebuild the network. Before they did that in 1995, after they lost Sudan, for example, and they took advantage of the conflict in Afghanistan, and they created an allegiance with the Taliban in order for al-Qaeda network to rebuild itself. After the Arab Spring, I think the calculus changed, and we saw them doing it not only like they did it in Kandahar in Afghanistan, but also in Yemen and in Syria and so many other places around the Muslim world. After this network is rebuilt, and after we start realizing that we need to take down these regional conflicts and have peaceful solutions for these regional conflicts, I think it might be a big possibility that they will lash on the West again and on the United States again.
You were testifying on Friday, in fact, at Congress about terrorism funding. Again, we used to talk about how ISIS would take over oil fields and sell it, and the hostage taking and all that. How do terrorists make their money these days?
Well, you know, they still do all the stuff that they do. You still have the donors. You still have the, you know, criminal activity, looting of artifacts, oil, hostages. But also at the same time, the most important funding mechanism, if you want to call it, for terrorist organizations is these conflicts that's happening across the Middle East. For example, look what's happening in Yemen today. Just an example, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, before the Arab coalition, the Saudi coalition war in the country, were less than 1,000. Today, they are way more than 7,000, and they are taking a lot of advantage of the conflict, and they are being aided directly and indirectly by the Arab coalition, because guess what? They are fighting, also they are fighting the Houthis, and the enemy of the enemy is my friend. friend.
Interesting. All right, Ali, stay there for a second. The attacks on the Pentagon, the Twin Towers, and in Pennsylvania launched the United States and our allies into two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, one of which we're still very actively fighting. The war in Afghanistan rages on 17 years later. The violence is far from contained there. It continues, as Ali was just saying, in Iraq. It's since spread to Syria and Yemen. For more on this, I'm joined by CJ Chivers, investigative reporter for the New York Times and author of the new book, The Fighters, Americans in Combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. And CJ, to the point that Ali Soufan was just making, we went into Afghanistan to attack the Taliban, which is supported by al-Qaeda. Now, as Ali is saying, we have diffuse terrorists all over the world, and we're still involved in this fight in Afghanistan, and it's not clear 17 years later that we have 17 years worth of success to show for it.
Afghanistan has had a lot of drift. So from the initial operation immediately after 9/11 to go and displace the Taliban and pursue al-Qaeda, we took on a number of nation-building projects and counterinsurgency efforts and tried a number of different strategies, many of which led us to drift. We still do maintain a counterterrorism platform there, which is still pursuing some of the terrorists that Ali was discussing, and I think that there's value in that. I think the national interest in the American investment in Afghanistan is something we probably need to sort out as part of our strategy.
Look, you're a journalist, you're a Pulitzer Prize winner, but you are definitely, you've written a book about average, regular people fighting these wars. So you are arguably sympathetic toward those people there, but to ask a question like you just asked, what's the national interest in continuing to do that? How do you continue fighting a war when lots of reasonable people are asking that question? How do these people who you write about justify being there and risking their lives every day when we don't really know the answer to that question?
So we're really talking about, as we approach these wars, we almost have to cleave our brains in half, separating the good people who show up in good faith with the public service intention of trying to prevent future attacks and with defending the country, not just from terrorism, but from many other threats, because in some ways terrorism is only one of the things we need to worry about right now as a nation. We have to separate that from the national projects, which to me have felt for many years to be adrift and maybe not connected to realistic or achievable goals on real timelines. And so the people who fight these wars, they show up in good faith. They take care of each other. They pursue the missions that the country gives them. But I think some of them sometimes do wonder, I know some of them often do wonder how this, for instance, what they're doing on a given patrol in Afghanistan makes us more safer here.
Because they sign up to do that. They sign up, like the good people of the FBI and the CIA, they sign up to help. They're patriots. Their lives are on the line. There are jobs you can do where you don't risk your life on a daily basis.
They invest everything over the course of minimally 4 years to try to serve the country. That's inarguable. And we have a duty to connect their good faith and their tactics that we engage them to realistic strategy. And that's where I see the disconnect. This book that you're talking about is about the human experience of war and about how these wars played out for the people who volunteered for them. We'd like to have that connected to something that would make us all safer.
Do you fear that 17 years later, we don't treat this with the same importance? These people you write about, some of them die, and sometimes a newspaper publishes their name.
I think that there is clearly a disconnect between the fighting class and the rest of the country, and to a large extent between the fighting class and the body politic. And it's all related, in my view, to not having a draft. We have a very small population that has served in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's about 1%, less than 1% of our country. When we expand it out to include their family members, we still don't get to 10%. We do not have skin in the game as a public, and because of that, we don't hold our politicians to account. And the body politic, in some ways, operates under a condition that I call uninformed consent.
Ali, do you see a reason or an ability to justify to these people that CJ writes about why we're in Afghanistan?
I think they are fighting for each other at this point. I think we gave them a mission to get rid of the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and they successfully did that the first week. I think our military answer to the public and, to the political leadership, and it's a political decision that we're there at this point. And I believe it's a lot complicated to a lot of the different regional aspects with Pakistan and China and Iran and Russia. So it's very complicated, but those guys, those folks are just fighting for each other, fighting for one another, like towards the end of Vietnam, and I agree with everything that CJ said.
CJ, there are soldiers, or there are people who have fought in Afghanistan who have come back and said, maybe it's time to end this war. The problem we've got, of course, is that we now have a situation that when we get out of things, we sometimes create vacuums that leave space for those very groups that Ali Soufan is talking about. So while it's tempting for some people to say, let's just get out of all of these things, we don't know what the national interest is, there seems to have been a new national interest that has developed in not having countries be governmental vacuums.
So you're defining a puzzle to which I don't present an answer, and I don't see it as my job to present an answer. I'm not dodging the question when I say we need a national strategy that is drawn from the full engagement of the population, right, and the body politic, because that's a big, big puzzle. And I don't propose that we instantly leave and expect a good outcome either. I think we need to engage more thoroughly so that, I mean, for you or any of us at the table, can we articulate really why we're in Afghanistan, when we're coming home, what success looks like? We should be able to do that as a country.
Yeah. Well, guys, thanks very much for your input. This is a tough discussion to have 17 years later, but we're still having it, and we appreciate your input. Ali Soufan, former FBI special agent in the counterterrorism division and the author of the book Anatomy of Terror, From the Death of bin Laden to the Rise of the Islamic State, and CJ Chivers, investigative reporter with the New York Times, author of The Fighters, Americans in Combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. These two books are crucial reads. Please pick them up and read them. We are going to be hearing from the president just moments